just as a sort of off, well, it's not off topic, but it's tied to the project more than what we're going over. We were talking, Candace set up a talk with the guy at Pillbox Pharmacy that's closing, that's been there for 46 years up there in Kaimuki. So an interesting talk for about 2 hours yesterday, which was really entertaining. He has some really fascinating photos in there. He's going to be closing on next Wednesday, I think he's closing. But if you get a chance, you might want to go in and check. The whole place is almost like all the walls are partially museum. And if you're at all into surfing or waterman type stuff, he's not only a really, really good surfer, but he knows everybody. And he was part of the crew in the 60s and 70s that was hitting pipeline and developing the sort of the newer style that you guys now think of as sort of like the old style. Yeah, I didn't get a chance to ask him about the black trunks. That would have been fun to hear what he had to say. So he's got some fantastic stories. But if you want to see some really nice, interesting old boards, especially an old wooden board that I suspect is over 100 years old, he's just got sitting in the shop. So if you're into surfing, go in there. You're going to see some stuff that's amazing. But he had some pictures in there. I didn't realize, if you guys remember back when you guys were in high school, we used to have star markets here that then disappeared. And I don't know, I think they went under, but to be honest, I never paid much attention to why. If you go and ask your grandparents, I don't think your parents are old enough, but if you ask your grandparents, originally those stores were all called Piggly Wigglies, which I sort of vaguely remember seeing something like that in old mainland pictures, but Candace actually remembered, and she said that's actually a store chain in the Southwest or Southeast. So I haven't had a chance to look into that yet, but I hadn't realized that one of the mainland Southeast grocery store chains, for some reason, had 11 stores here in Hawaii, and then sold them in the 70s, I think, no, 60s, I think you said 60s, to what became Star Market. So if you really want to freak your grandparents out and they're from here, ask them, if they remember Piggly Wiggly, which has to be, at least in my one, that's probably what I remember. It seems like the strangest name for a grocery store I've ever heard of, but not to mention a little bit, I don't know, the idea of going into a grocery store that has the name Wiggly on the top of it just strikes me as a little bit creeped out if you're going to buy like veggies and stuff, but whatever. So just sort of as a, totally off topic Trivial Pursuit thing. Okay. Yeah, Koreans. This group, I don't know. Someone, it's especially because if you're familiar with Korean soap operas, especially if you remember back when you guys were probably in maybe maybe grade school, the huge thing that hit here in Hawaii, and I swear everyone in Hawaii, or at least about 80% of the population here, and even a large number of folks in the mainland were watching Daejumgum, which was the historical drama about a lady who's a physician, or I don't remember what it was. My wife was into it, all my relatives watched it, but all I knew was the costumes were really nice. So even today, Korean soap operas are a huge thing. So it's a sort of ironic because the first generation Korean, in fact, both of the different groups of Koreans in Hawaii could actually make a really good soap opera. The story is very convoluted. It's got all sorts of twists and turns, and it doesn't fit the patterns for the other groups in many ways. If you go back and look in Canvas, I actually found, to be honest right now, I don't remember where I found it just a couple of weeks ago, a short little autobiography by one of the Korean picture brides, which actually sort of reinforces a lot of what I'm going to go through today. So then that's actually going to sort of get the sense of it from one person's personal experience, but there's very little in that story that's unique to that lady. That's very much the norm in a lot of ways. So when we left off Tuesday in episode 1, the Korean political system was collapsing. The Korean government was basically gone. The Japanese were stirring up huge amounts of unrest, and they were targeting specifically Christians, Korean Christians, who were basically the middle urban class in Korea, which I guess the Japanese figured were one, they were a small part of the population. A lot of the population was envious because they were fairly wealthy and well-to-do. And secondly was that they were a group that was educated, which the Japanese probably thought was the threat because the Japanese take over Korea by 1910, 1911. So anyway, so when I was looking at this morning, it just suddenly dawned on me, I was looking at the PowerPoint, that for all the noise that the Europeans were doing, I've never heard anything about the British and the French missions, and the British had big missions, the French had huge Marist missions in Korea as they did in northern China. I've never heard of anything about them actually trying to get Koreans out of Korea. I have a sneaking suspicion that if they did, they probably just shipped them to other parts of their Asian colonies. But if anyone's looking for a PhD dissertation, you could probably do a really interesting one on, you know, what the British and French missions did to help Korean Christians out in the same period. So the American missions, the same, including at least in part the missionary groups that were involved here, were like the big players in rescuing these folks. And that's, again, as I think I finished last time, that's where the plantations step in and they say, sure, you know, we can take these folks in. But in their view, it was with the idea that what they're going to do is they're going to be plantation labor. And, you know, you can't blame the plantations. I mean, from their standpoint, they weren't a nonprofit, they were a for-profit industry. And their stereotype of Asians was that Asians are hard workers. These guys should be happy to have a job versus being strung up from a lamp pole. So, you know, they just, I'm sure they didn't think about it. They said, hey, yeah, you know, people are always ditching the plantations. We can always use more labor. Sure, bring them on. And they apparently either paid part of their shipment over or, I think that's what it was, because the plantations were real bitter about the Koreans. So the plantations somehow got financially involved in helping them get over here. Not just, you know, providing access. And so the Koreans come over and it's about, I don't know, 11, 12, it's actually more than 11,000. That's the number I've got. I think it's more like 15,000 come over here in about a 6-year period. And the Japanese eventually then shut down migration around, I think, 1912, 1913, something like that, just before World War I. So these Koreans come over, and this group sort of wins one of the awards with one other group we'll get into for the group that is least successful on the plantations. They hit the plantations somewhere along the line, and we'll get into it in a little while why I think part of that is. These guys, and this was almost entirely males, because as we'll see, Korean society was and still is very, very gender segregated. It's one of the most gender segregated societies I know of, in sort of, you know, modern contemporary societies. So these were all guys. They were all between the 18, maybe 14, 15 years of age and probably about 25, 30. And they were almost always either first or second sons, which, if you know anything about Asian societies, is not a group that usually leaves home. But that's the group that the families wanted to save because they were afraid they were going to get whacked. So this is a group that comes over here. Now, in Korean society, more so than their other counterparts, more so than Japanese or Chinese society, urban intellectuals who are first sons are incredibly privileged. They're like little, the Chinese have this problem now, and they call them little emperors. And that's sort of what these Korean guys were. They'd grown up in a life of privilege. Everyone kowtowed to them and did whatever they wanted to. So they'd grown up basically being treated like they were something really, really special. And all of a sudden they find themselves on a boat. They find themselves in Hawaii, and here's some guy giving them a little aluminum tag with a number on it and saying, okay, you're number 327, and you're going to go to the Punene sugar mill. And all this in English, which of course they don't understand because they're monolingual. And these guys are thinking, you know, we're special people. You know, we're educated, we're urban. We've got servants at home. You know, all this type of stuff. They're very privileged. They'd be basically upper class in European society. And so, you know, then all of a sudden some guy's telling them in pidgin, you know, some Portuguese, Hawaiian, Luna or something like that, is giving them a machete and saying, here, you know, go cut cane. And they're like, what's a machete? So the plantations, more than they usually did, tried to help this group out. Having said that, this group was never going to get into manual labor. They didn't do manual labor. They told their servants to do it back home. They never probably engaged in manual labor. To them, manual labor was something distasteful that peasants did. So this was a group that basically found themselves in a nightmare. Some of them actually wrote home. We have a few of the letters, and some of these guys actually wrote home they would rather be in Korea risking being dead than be in Hawaii working on a plantation because it was so demeaning. So as you can imagine, this didn't work out at all. These guys did a lot of little sit-down protest strikes. They didn't organize, but they would just sort of, a group of like 10 of them in a plantation would just sort of sit down saying, we're not going to do it. And they go into pout. And the plantations would just sort of like, you know, initially try to cut them some slack because they were basically sort of refugees. But then after a couple of weeks or months of this, the plantation says, well, screw that. You know, you guys didn't do anything to get here. We helped you over here. And here's your payment for services rendered is to work. And these guys are like, no. And so this whole thing just falls apart dramatically. The Korean men that come over in this sort of refugee situation, the plantations across the board agreed that they were the worst possible group they ever had. They would do anything to avoid doing work. They thought they were better than the other folks in the workforce. They just basically were a nightmare. They were like a stereotype of your worst employee. And so in that situation, these guys just walked from the plantation. And of all the groups, it sort of says something. The plantations usually would spend a fair amount of time and effort trying to track people down that broke contract and left. So if you're Chinese, Japanese, Okinawan, any group, and you leave, the plantations, they wouldn't spend a lot of time, but they would keep track of where you were, where you might be, and if they caught you, they'd arrest you and bring you back and force you back on the plantation. The Koreans, when they left, the plantations were like, fine. They're like, fine, you guys, just get the hell out of our sight. We don't want to see you guys again. Now, the problem this group gets into then is they're not on the plantations long enough to learn Pidgin. So they never, unlike the other groups, they don't spend enough time on the plantation to actually assimilate to what you might call local lifestyles, which were around by 1910. You're already in the second, in some cases, almost third generation of locals. And so these guys aren't a part of it. They don't want to be a part of it. As far as they're concerned, this is just a small, short nightmare that they're going to wake up from, and they're going to be back in their bed in their really nice middle-class home in Korea, and their servant's going to wake them up in the morning and feed them. So they sort of see this thing as a temporary, like a bad hangover or something like that. You just have to get through it. So they don't engage with Hawaii. They don't engage with the entire process. And they don't want to be here. And of course, the job skills they have, which are, to be a Korean business person as maybe a shop or something in Seoul, Korea, there's nothing about that that's going to transfer to Hawaii. You already have shopkeepers. You have Chinese and Portuguese shopkeepers, Japanese shopkeepers. Every part of the ecosystem here in terms of the social system has already got people in it, and they're motivated and they're trying really hard to get ahead and make money. So a group of guys walking around like prima donnas, no one's going to have any sympathy for them. And so the Koreans get a real bad rap here, the guys in this first generation, because basically the rest of the population goes like, why do you think you're special? I would say legitimately, Koreans didn't have anything that made them unique per se. So basically, they're just sort of a disaster. And so, for large numbers of them end up working in sort of half-assed jobs, and especially in town. So a huge proportion of this Korean population ends up in Honolulu. Very few of them in the outer islands, a few in Kahului. I think the little group in Hilo, but they immediately leave the rural areas or the plantations. They immediately cluster in the urban areas, which sort of makes sense because, of course, they're urban boys. That's where they came from. So they're in the cities, and they're basically trying to make a go of it. Japanese take over Korea, but they allow communications back and forth. So they don't close the place down. So these guys are then writing home. You have to remember all these guys are literate. So these guys are writing home, and because they're the privileged sons of the family's telling them, yeah, you can't come back because the Japanese are going to arrest your ass and throw you in the army or something like that. So they start to realize that going home, that I think they originally thought pretty much they'd be able to stay here for a year and then go home once the sort of the dust settled on the whole thing. But the realization kicked in after maybe 5 years or something that ain't going to happen, and they're stuck here. And they're stuck here, and yet they have, a half-assed job washing dishes in a restaurant or something like that, which is not, of course, as good as they think they should be. So this is a really bitter group that's not happy at all. They came over here because their families insisted they should. And somewhere along the line, and you have to remember, Korean society is one, very family-oriented, and two, like other Asian societies, it's very much as the group's more important than the individual. So what happens next, you sort of have to remember that you've got these normative attitudes or values that make Koreans look very much like Chinese and Japanese and Okinawans, etc. But what happens next is really sort of a trip, because that all sort of falls apart. It's really hard to figure why, and I've never seen a good discussion of the dynamics of this. So the guys basically decide they're stuck here. So what they then do is they contact their families back home and say, well, if I'm going to have to live here for a while, then I need a wife. I need to start a family. Because as in the rest of Asian societies, that's how you identify. Now, unlike the other Asian populations that come over here, the Koreans don't see themselves as part of a village or a group. And they don't have the Japanese, or I should say, they don't have the Chinese concept of people of the same last name are related. So even though there aren't a lot of Korean last names, all the folks with the last name of Kim, for example, don't see them as related to the other Kims. And it's all based, their family is their family tree. So these guys don't join together. Unlike the Chinese who form associations, and the Japanese who basically sort of reconstruct, what part of the area around Hiroshima they're from. The Koreans don't do that. The Koreans stay here as unique sort of individuals. They don't join into associations or groups or try to hang out with other Koreans and sort of make a life collectively and help each other out. So what happens then is these guys then contact the family back home. They say, okay, I need a wife. Now, because these guys were doing so poor financially here, in almost all these cases, these guys aren't able to send any money home. And to be honest, given their attitude about how special they were, I think they, in fact, at least, in a few letters, they kept on insisting the family should send them money to help them out in Hawaii. And of course, the families are wiped. I mean, Korea's at the ends of a civil war. It's now under Japanese occupation. There's no money going out of Korea. I don't even think you could send money out of Korea. So the family who thought that these, they were saving their son's life, but also the son was going to help them out financially, just like the rest of the groups here, suddenly find that if anything, not only is the guy not sending money to them, but he's actually insisting that they help him out. So somewhere along the line, this whole thing sort of cracks, just like a crack in a piece of glass. And what happens is the guy becomes very insistent he needs a wife. Now, the family then, because of the idea of family obligation, they do have to provide him for a wife, because in Asian societies till very recently, in fact, in a lot of Asia still today, marriages are technically arranged. In Asian societies, whether it be Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Okinawan, whatever, you can't marry someone if the family doesn't accept them. So you need the family's input before you even get seriously engaged. You do not find someone you love, get engaged, and then take them home to show them to the family. That don't work. Families have a veto power over relationships, and that's it's not quite the old system of arranged marriages, which it was until the 1930s or 40s, which is basically a family picks your spouse for you and says, "Here, congratulations, here's your new husband, or here's your new wife." But it's still very much family defined. And I know, because we've been in this situation a couple of times, we've actually vetoed a couple of prospective fiancés for our nieces and stuff. And then the family just said no, and that's it. Can't see them anywhere. So that's the norm. And so the family did have this as an obligation. They knew they had it as an obligation. So sort of hold a timeout on that. Let's go to another thing. This is another hugely Korean value. It isn't unique to Korean society per se. Chinese have somewhat the same idea. But the difference is that in Korean society, a lot of stuff seems to be sort of like hyper exaggerated. And one of these hyper exaggerations is the urban versus rural. In Korean society, the three large cities, Busan, Seoul, and for some reason the third always escapes me, it'd be Pyongyang actually. The three large cities basically were considered the urban centers. Now in Korean society, for some reason, I don't know how far that goes back, but it goes back a ways. There was this very strong attitude that you could only be educated, you could only be sophisticated, and you could only be anything if you were from a city. And that meant these three places. So it wasn't a city, it was one of these three cities, and you had to have lived in it. So you had to be born in it. If you're from any place else, now that could be a good sized town, it could be out in the countryside, whatever it is, then you're dirt. So in Korean society, there was a very strong attitude that there's urban folks who are special just by virtue of where they're from. And there's everyone else who's basically a peasant. And peasants can't become urbanites unless they live in the city for a generation or two, so like pay their dues, and at which point now they are. And urbanites would never, never, never go to the countryside. So Koreans have a very strong attitude, and this is still very true today in Korea, even in 2020, that if you're not from the big cities, which is now only two pretty much, Busan and Seoul, if you're not from the cities, then you're basically crap. It's almost impossible to get ahead. You might make a lot of money, but you're never going to be accepted socially because you're not from the cities. Now, this is one reason why Seoul has one of the largest percentages of total country population in its urban area of any country in the world. It's very much looks like Honolulu. It's basically like this 800-pound gorilla in Korea, where everyone who's anyone has to live in Seoul if they're going to be legit. So if you want to get ahead, if you want a family to get ahead, you've got to live in that city. No place else works. Busan a little bit, but not too much. But if from any place else, you're out of luck. Now you have to remember that unlike a lot of places, there's not a different dialect here. The people don't look any different. There's no way to tell whether someone who's Korean is from the country or the city. I suppose the only way you know they're from the country maybe is because they got a good tan because they work out in the fields. But the city and the country are this huge dichotomy. And so these guys that come over here, these privileged refugees, are from the city. So they're going to be very pale because, of course, they don't go out and they don't get sun, because the last thing they want to be seen of as laborers or rural, which is one reason why the plantation is such a nightmare. It's their worst dream come true, is being seen as a laborer. So when they contact going catching back up to ourselves, when they contact their families and they say, we need a spouse. For some reason, and this is happens a ton of the time, and it's by far the norm, the families take a look at the guy's request, and what they do almost invariably is they do two things. One is they do not find them a spouse from the same socioeconomic group as the family. And my only guess would be is maybe they thought that these guys had deserted the family by not sending money back. I don't know. I don't know what the logic was, but it was pretty much collective that these guys have not earned a good wife. So what they do is they find women who are rural, because basically that family will actually pay the son's family to get their daughter out of Korea and marry someone who's upwardly mobile. So they'll pay for that to happen. So that's good because you actually make some money out of it. And that's sort of strange because in Asian societies, making money off your relatives is not how things are supposed to be done. So the family's acting really weird here. The second thing they do, and this is the one that's really striking, and I guess, again, another timeout for a social factor. Korean society has this very, very strange system. And again, I've never figured out why, because it's not Asian, it's a peculiarly Korean thing. If a woman marries a guy, so you've got a couple here, and so she's going to move in with his family. Remember, like the Chinese and the Japanese, it's patrilineal, patrilocal. So she moves in with her husband's family. If something happens to him, if he dies and they've got kids, she and the kids will be thrown out of his family. Now, what's really strange about this, of course, is when they married, she doesn't take his last name. It's like you see in China, it's usually a hyphenated last name. But the kids, of course, are his kids. They're not her kids because they're in his house. They're living with his parents and his other relatives. So those kids are part of his family. Korean society, as far as I know, is unique. And if he dies and she's a widow, the kids and her get thrown out of the house. Now, like other Asian societies, if you're a woman and you get thrown out of your marriage family, you can't go back to your birth family. They won't accept you back because you married and you moved into another family. You've given up your family ties to your birth family. So given the troubles that were occurring in the early 20th century, where a lot of Korean guys were getting whacked, you end up with a large number of widows in Korean society, many of whom have kids. And they basically end up on the street. Many of them become shamans, which is a big thing in Korea, and still is, at least in South Korea. And so you end up with this large population of women with children who were married. These aren't kids out of wedlock. These are actually kids that belong to a family, but the family has disowned them when their son has died. And if you think about it, that's such a weird thing to do, especially from an Asian context, because you're getting rid of your next generation of sons in many cases, which I've never been able to fathom what it is about that. So it's something very Korean. So in this period of time when these families are looking for women to marry their son, apparently a lot of them go, hey, this is perfect. This woman will scrape a little bit of money together. She's totally desperate. She's a widow. She's got, say 2 kids, and we'll say, fantastic. Here, our son's living in Hawaii. You go marry him. Now, American immigration law until the 1960s was that I think in Asia was like 300 or 600 Asians allowed into the United States per year. So, there was a huge backlog of people that wanted in, and there was no way that you could get these women in if they were just going to apply for, immigration to the United States. Oh, I want to go marry this guy. Then people looking like, that ain't happening. Especially single women, we're not going to be allowed into the United States. So what happens is they look at the immigration thing, and this was not uniquely Korean. The Chinese didn't do this, but Japanese and Okinawans did, especially Japanese. These are what we call picture brides. And this occurs in 2 parts. There's pictures in 2 parts of this. First, there's a picture in the sense that the son, for example, here, if he's one of these Korean guys, he takes a picture and he sends it back to the family so they have something to show the bride's, his prospective bride's family. Now, the guys here, almost to a person, and in fact, it shows up, I think, in that oral history, did not send pictures back of who they were when they were asking. So if it's like 1915, he doesn't go out to a photographic place and get a picture taken of him in 1915. He finds a picture that's oftentimes right when he first came over, maybe 5 or 10 years earlier. He's younger, he's still got good clothes around. So he takes a picture that sort of emulates the lifestyle he likes to project rather than who he actually is. So it's very much what people do on their Facebook, Instagram, and other accounts. They hype it up. It's not them. It's a fake them. So in this situation, that's what he sends back to the family. Now, you know that the family would obviously, they see a picture, they know it's been 10 years since they've seen their son, and he looks exactly like the day he left. They're thinking like, dude, what the hell? But they don't ask any questions. That's the picture that they show the prospective bride. And so they then take a picture of her, they send it to him, and he goes, okay. But they don't tell him that she's actually either rural or a widow with kids. They just sort of forget to mention that. So as you can see, it's sort of like a train wreck getting ready to happen. They then go, and what they do is they have a member of his family, one of his other brothers or some other male member of the family, does a wedding ceremony where they actually hold the guy's picture. So, if I'm his brother, I do the wedding, but I've got my brother's picture, the guy in Hawaii's picture, in front of me. And so the marriage is actually between the picture and the lady. And at that point, they're then going to sign, the authorities will sign that so-and-so, she's now married to the picture, not to me, to the picture. So then when she applies for access to Hawaii, she can actually say, oh, I'm so-and-so's wife, and I want to go live with my husband. And that means that she doesn't have to go through the immigration quotas, because part of the American immigration policy is you don't break up families, which is sort of ironic given the whole mess this last couple of years on the American U.S.-Mexican border. But that was the policy. You don't break up families. Your families should stay intact. So if you're someone's wife or their child, then you don't have to follow through immigration quotas. You're fast-tracked in. So these women come over here, and they've invariably got that picture, because if nothing else, they got to show it to the authorities. Oh, this is the guy I married. And they get off the boats. This would be at Sand Island, where all the boats got off. That was the immigration station. So they get off at Sand Island, and they're looking, because of course it would have been announced they're showing up on a particular day. And they've got this picture, and they're looking for the guy. Now, this is sort of like those catfishing episodes. You ever watch that MTV series? So this lady's got this picture. Mind you, she's got 2 kids behind her too. And she's looking for this guy and this group of guys, and she doesn't see anyone until she realizes there's some guy waving at her, but he looks really old. He looks like, he looks like this guy's uncle, or the picture's uncle or something like that. He doesn't look near as sophisticated. He looks pretty trashed out. He looks, pretty sketchy compared to what she thought she was getting, what the family thought or what the family had told her. And she's like, no, man, this can't be right. It's like, but the guy actually comes, he knows her name, and he says, oh, da 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 da. Now, of course, you have to remember, they're married. They're not meeting each other. They are actually married. And if she says, who the hell are you, and flips him the middle finger and walks off, then she's going to find herself on a boat back to Korea. And she doesn't have the way to even pay for that. If he says, no, you're not my wife, then the situation he's got into is the fact that he's telling the entire Korean world or community in Hawaii that his family screwed him over, that he probably lied to his family. So the loss of face or image is going to be huge. So both parties sort of look at this thing and they're like, oh man, I've been ripped. And then of course he's looking at her picture, and the picture's accurate. That's, so it's just a recent picture. But he's looking at this and he's saying, well, who are these 2 kids? They're saying, oh, they're my kids. And he's going like, what? Unless immaculate conception occurred, they can't be his kids because he'd never seen her before. So then it comes out, of course, that she's a widow, which there's this enormous stigma in Korean society. But again, he can't say anything about it, because if he does, he's going to look stupid to everyone else. So the family set this thing up to be a train wreck. The guys helped set it up to be a train wreck by lying about who they were. And the only one that gets totally reamed out is the poor lady, who was just basically, this is her last option on planet Earth, especially because she's got children in many cases. So these women come over, and they have been reamed over by everyone. So the vast majority of the relationships, they stop right there. The couple might actually live together for a year or two, but they don't have any relationship. They don't even talk to each other. Basically, she's sort of like renting, a couple of square meters in his apartment. So at least he can pretend that he's got a wife and a family. Though, of course, everyone else in Honolulu is going to wonder where the kids came from. So he's got to make up some weird story about that of course, no one believes. And the lady's just sort of like, what am I going to do? Now, the key with these women, unlike their husbands, is these women come over. They're all rural. They are all illiterate, with almost no exceptions. They've got no useful job skills other than being a rural housewife and farmer in rural Korea. And in many cases, they've got kids, small children. So if you ever looked at a group where you said, okay, these are the group that you're going to have migrate to Hawaii, this would probably be on the top of the list in terms of a group that's going to totally get screwed over. They're not going to be able to find a job. They're constantly going to be desperately in need of resources. They're just going to be a nightmare. At least that's what you would think. And that's what initially happens. But then several things sort of come actually that are very striking about this entire process. One is that, let's see, it's the right next one here. It's cut on here, everything's gone to sleep. Oh, here we go. They come over here, and unlike their husbands, they find themselves a niche. And the niche existed till the 1970s, and then it disappears. But especially pre-World War II, it was a huge niche. And this was the Korean bars. Now, the Korean bars aren't what they were, from the 1960s on, though there were still a few left. The Korean bars prior to 1942 were a real interesting social phenomenon because, at some point these women realized pretty much, I don't know, collectively, but they helped each other out. Unlike the males, the women over here very much formed a network because they all knew they'd been totally screwed over and there was no one else they could get assistance from, and their husbands were a total waste of time, and in many cases had entirely disowned them. So they had no other fallback. So what they do, and again, of course, they don't have the plantation experience. They're not on the plantation, so they're not learning pidgin. They're not figuring out how things work. They're getting none of that. They just find themselves plopped down in urban Honolulu with no idea what the hell's going on. So what they do is very quickly, the first group that comes over, in many cases, actually goes down to the piers when these women are coming ashore. And actually, when they see this disaster, when the two people meet, is they then actually approach the women and say, hey, do you need a place to stay? And you need a job. And of course, they're talking to them, they're Korean, they're talking to them in Korean. The women are almost invariably going, yeah. If they are here and they're stuck with a husband who's ignoring them, then they frequently find out very quickly about this network also. They see another Korean lady and ask her. So what happens is this group very quickly finds their niche. And their niche is actually the first generation of Chinese, Okinawan, Japanese, and to a certain extent Portuguese that came over as laborers. If I'm Chinese and I came over in 1878, and it's now, let's make it 1880, it's too hard for me to do the math, and it's now 1910, or we'll say 1915. I've been here for 35 years, 40 years. I'm now in my late 50s or my 60s. I'm one of the group that didn't find a wife, so I'm single, but I'm getting old. I was brought up in a society where family is everything, and I have no family, I have no relatives. I might have a group of guys I sort of hang out with that I consider sort of like relatives, but they're actually fake in the sense that I know they're not my relatives. And I have to be very careful what I say to them because I'm not sure what they're going to say to anyone else. So I pretty much find myself lonely in a tremendously like big high caps, red letters, lonely. What the Korean women did is they set up basically refugee spots or rest stops for lonely guys. The Korean bars, and I actually, when we used to work at Bishop Museum years ago, back in the 70s, there was actually one of the few last Korean bars was near Bishop Museum. And it was absolutely a fascinating place to go to because if you go into this place, there'd be TVs on the walls. I don't know what they did in the 20s and 30s, probably radios. TVs on the walls. The women were old. They were dressed, sort of like housewives. So they weren't dressed up, like it wasn't like a bar. They were called Korean bars, but it's not actually an accurate term. They did serve alcohol. So you'd see guys come in, and the guys were always old. There were all these old guys would come in. They'd come into the place. There was obviously a woman they know. So of one of the women that were working there, would be one of them that was like their friend. And they'd come in there, the lady'd say hi, and they'd talk story, immediately start talking story. She'd immediately sit him down at apparently was his regular spot, because these guys all had special spots and special tables. She'd bring him what he was supposed to have. He didn't have to order anything. So, if it's like lunchtime, it'd be like a beer and then, a kalbi and I don't know, whatever else you're going to get. So he'd have his lunch. And she sits down next to him, they talk like they're relatives. In fact, the first time I went in there, I thought that they were related. They acted like brothers and sisters, or to a certain extent, maybe husband and wives. And I couldn't figure out what was going on because the guys that had been there at Bishop longer knew how the place worked, but I'd never actually seen them. And actually at that time, never heard about them. But they were fascinating to go to because if you went in there and you weren't one of these old guys and you didn't know the women, you felt totally like an outsider because these places really felt like someone's kitchen or living room. But they weren't a bar. You didn't go there to get drunk or socialize and party and have a good time. They were places where you went to meet someone that you'd known for years, who knew what you liked, who would sit down for an hour or two and listen to you complain about everything in the world, and you knew perfectly comfortably they'd never say a word to anyone else. So what the women did is the women provide surrogate families and surrogate spouses and surrogate, brothers, sisters, to these old, lonely guys, the Chinese, Japanese, Okinawans, whatever. That's what they did. And they made a ton of money because you had a very large population of single men who were tired, they were old, they were incredibly lonely. The realization had finally hit they were never going home, they were going to die in Hawaii, they were never going to have a family, and no one was going to care when they died. So in that context, these women basically took their skill set, which was being a wife and being a supportive spouse, and put it into a economic situation of a bar. And that's the famous Korean bars. The Korean bars didn't engage in sex, they didn't engage in drugs, and they didn't get people super drunk. If anything, if the guy drank too much, the lady and her friends would actually help him home. And he knew that. So this whole thing was based on trust. And you see this because when you get into the 60s and 70s, the last of the Korean bars, it was very typical when these guys did finally pass away, this even in the 20s and 30s, they would actually leave a large part of their estate, whatever they had made money and stuff, they would leave it to the woman in the bar that had basically been their surrogate spouse, sister, whatever. And so what happened is these women very quickly started to initially just work in one of these places. Then what they quickly do is get a fair amount of money together because these guys were willing to pay. They had money. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had money. And they were willing to pay for this social relationship. So it was sort of a pay-as-you-go social life, but it became very emotionally close between the women and the guys. And frequently they would handle things like the funeral expenses and all sorts of other stuff. They would actually act in the same way they would with a spouse. So these guys basically found themselves with a sort of rent-a-wife, I guess, but that's sort of tacky because it was actually emotionally closer than that. But that's how it sort of plays out. And in that context, that's the job that the women served. And for their point, it was absolutely fantastic. It didn't matter if they spoke very good Pidgin initially, because they were there to listen. They were there to be sympathetic. The guys just wanted someone to vent to that weren't going to go and tell the story around town. And they wanted someone who emotionally would actually listen to them and pay attention to what they had to say. And so the women provided that service, and that actually fit their skill set. The fact that they had kids, running around, for example, in the bar, the guy, that didn't bother the guy because he didn't have any, relationship with the woman. So to him, the kids are actually the family he didn't have. So to a certain extent, the kids actually enhance this. So the kids grow up in the bar with these surrogate fathers. The women in the bars very quickly go from making money in the bar to, in most cases, staying in very small places and then turning around and buying the building the bar's in, and then buying the block that the building the bar's in. So by the 30s, a lot of these women had become incredibly successful in terms of owning real estate. They had large investments, they'd made a lot of money, and they'd done it by virtue of being a social caretaker for old guys. If you want to think about it, they were the equivalent of a care home, what they call assisted living, or whatever the hell they call it for old folks. That would be what the women did in what looked like sort of a bar setting, which in some ways I think would actually be more friendly because, the guys are able to have a drink. This lady knows their favorite food. If there's, if there's a baseball game playing and she knows they like baseball, she'll make sure it's on the TV. She'll watch the game with them and talk story. So it's a very intimate one-on-one relationship these women had with these guys. And I remember seeing once we were in there having lunch, and one guy was there and he was a little too long, and another guy came up and he was obviously the next to this lady's friends. And the one guy goes, "Oh, sorry, I'm over," apologizes to the other guy, and then leaves. And the other guy sits down, and boom, she starts up exactly the same relationship with the second guy. And it wasn't like she was making stories. She actually did emotionally care about them. And they knew that. And, you saw that, and all of a sudden you could realize why these guys would leave them, what they had in their bank accounts or whatever when they passed away. These women were the closest people to them in their lives. That's what the first generation of Korean women did. Now, because of their lack of education, but the realization that education was how you got ahead. In other words, remember, they're still Korean. What they did is they were absolutely totally aggressive in pushing their kids to be hyper successful. So while the first generation, the migratory group of Korean Christian guys is an absolute failure economically, socially, everything. They just vanish from planet Earth. The Korean women, in other words, they're surrogate wives, the picture brides. They become not only the most successful group per capita in terms of the amount of money they make, but that Korean population generates more doctors and lawyers than any other group in Hawaii. So the kids of that wife, kids of that woman, become the most single successful professional group in Hawaii ever. And that says something about what those women were able to do. Those women had some serious focus. And so it's interesting because the Korean bar, that's the Korean bar of the first half of the 20th century. World War II, and the military shows up, and the military comes over, you have a larger number of service people, they go into there and they want to get drunk and they want some sex. It's important to remember that sex was legal in Hawaii. It was down in Iwalei. There was actually a red light district, and there were actually women and guys in little weird cubicles that for an amount you actually paid for 30 minutes or an hour, and you got your sexual needs satisfied. And they were checked by the health department every week or something like that. So pay for sex was easily available and accessible in Honolulu, pretty much run by the Yakuza by 1910, 1915. So it was always there. So when the military come in, the women could actually tell them, no, you're not going to get sex. You go over here and get it. And there's actually some pictures you can find in the state archives of guys lining up to go into brothels here in Honolulu, which didn't get a lot of publicity at the time, obviously. So these women were not part of the sex trade. But the military come in and they just change the dynamic of the bars, because they come in and they see the word bar and they think that means I can get drunk, I can get something to eat. And in fact, you still see this. If you look at bars here in a lot of Honolulu in the older districts, one of the things that's sort of striking is the very good menu. A lot of the older bars here, especially if you got like I have Pearl City, they actually have good food. And that's a major part of what they provide their customers. It's not just a place to get drunk on your butt and, throw up on your neighbor or something like that. It actually is a social place where the food's as important as the companionship. And that's actually sort of a remnant of the old Korean style bars. Post World War II, you still got the military here in large numbers. Your local population, the guys that it's, sort of supported these bars in many cases have passed on. And the women, of course, are getting very old. And then it's too stressful. And of course, they're not going to let their kids work in these because their kids are now professionals. They're very successful. So the bars sort of fade out. And in most cases, the Koreans then sell them. And they move either to Chinese or some cases Vietnamese and other groups here from Asia that sort of take over the Korean bars, but they totally change the ethos of the bar into very much a sort of classic urban, place for drugs and sex and a lot of drinks. Sort of the classic stereotype of an urban sort of sketchy bar. But if you go back 60, 80 years, the Korean bars were an entirely different phenomenon. And like I said, the last one I remember is the one near Bishop Museum in the mid 70s. And it closed by, I think, 1978 it was closed. I don't know of any others. You might ask your grandparents, remember if they knew. But that first group is absolutely fascinating. They're a good example that there were always niches in the social system here for work. You just had to figure out where your fit was, that you would fit into that niche, and then you had to take absolute advantage of it. Because these women weren't getting paid very much, but they actually would save every penny, and they became tremendously successful just because they were so focused. So that's the first group. Second group of Koreans. Post 1965-66, the American immigration laws change. They've revoked the quota thing. By the mid-60s, you had Korean society, and by now we're just talking about South Korea, had gone through enormous political and social change. And by the 1960s, of course, World War II ends and the Korea is split up into North and South Korea. In 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, takes over the entire country with the exception of a little tiny spot. The South Korean, i.e. United Nations, take over all of South and North Korea, except for a little tiny spot. The Chinese come in, the whole thing goes back again, it goes back again. And by 1952, 1953, the whole war stops right on the same border where it started. So for literally millions of casualties and both countries being entirely leveled with almost nothing left in either North or South Korea, it goes back to where it starts. And just to make you guys totally paranoid and totally cheerful week anyways, it's important to remember the Korean War has never ended. It's a truce. The Korean War is still technically an active war with the United Nations against North Korea, with Chinese support on the North Korean side. There's a truce in 1952 or 1953, I don't remember exactly when, and that's still what's in effect today. So North Korea is still technically at war with pretty much the rest of the world. People just haven't been shooting each other very much since 1953, but they're still at war. So there never was a peace treaty per se. So in that situation, South Korea first is a dictatorship after World War II, an American-sponsored dictatorship. In the 1960s, that starts to fall apart. So it's a whole mess of urban unrest. And for the middle class in Korean society, especially your professionals, doctors, lawyers, and stuff like that, very much sort of like the guys around the turn of the century, they're going back and they're going like, oh no, here we go again. Korea's going to fall apart. So this group wants out if they can figure it out because they see the political, social destabilization in Korea hitting them. And they're wealthy, they're successful, and they have the ability, if they can get out, they can afford it. So when the quota law changes in the United States, this group in large numbers gets the hell out of town. And they come largely to Hawaii, in part because they knew there were Koreans here from an earlier period. So apparently they thought it'd be easier. They also move in large numbers to LA. So it's very focused. You don't find Koreans post 1960 scattered across the United States. It's not like the Chinese or the Japanese. They're very locust populations. LA has a large population. I think Seattle does. San Francisco has a few. Portland, for example, has none, which says something about Portland we don't get into. So it's a very focused population. It's almost entirely West Coast. I believe New York was the other center. But the majority come here. Now, they come here, and of course, they're coming here in the 60s, and of course, by the 60s, early 70s. And of course, by then we've changed. Now we're an older version of what you guys live in 2020. So when they come over here, this place has changed. It's now an urban part of the United States. Tourism was already by far the largest industry. But then they come to another thing that's really, really key. And that is the fact that this group coming over is not even the same as those guys in 1900. This group coming over as professionals. So they're lawyers, or for example, for some reason, there were a ton of them that were doctors and dentists, and I don't know what that was about. But if any of you are in the medical field, or you're going to go into the medical field, what's the problem if I'm a doctor? We'll say that I'm an oral surgeon. I have no idea what that means. I'm an oral surgeon in Seoul, Korea, and it's 1975, and I decided that I'm going to move to Hawaii, and I'm going to move my practice and become an oral surgeon in Honolulu. What's the problem I'm going to have? Let's see if you guys know this one. Remember, I've had a successful practice in Seoul. What's going to happen when I move to Honolulu and I want to set up a dental shop? I don't know, dental practice, whatever they call it. Why is that not going to work?
Has to get licensed, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, if you guys, you guys could go to get, if you're in the nursing program or medical program, you could get a degree in Japan or Korea. But if you come back and practice in the United States, they're going to go like, dude, who the hell do you think you are? And you're not certified by an American board-approved place, which is why the nursing program here is popular, because it's certified. So it doesn't matter if I've got diplomas covering a whole wall in Korea. I've got smiling pictures of the president, the head of the whole Korean Dental Association, saying I'm the best dentist ever. And that doesn't mean crap. In fact, the weird thing is not only can I not be a dentist, what also can't I not be? Can I even work in a dentist office? Nope. I'd have to go back to KCC and get their 2-year program to be a dental assistant. The only thing I could do in a dental office is be a receptionist. So all that years of experience, all that money I'd made, all the equipment I have, all that stuff I have isn't worth crap. It ain't happening. Now, one of the fascinating aspects, which goes back to a big part of what geographers always talk about, which is the idea that perception drives reality. There's an assumption that we live in a reality, that people have a sense of what's actually going on in the world around them. There's no evidence, at least to anthropologists and geographers, that's true. And in this particular second group is a perfect case in point. We'll say that I come over in 1975 and I can't find work. I came over here not by myself. I came over here with my wife and my 2 kids. And of course, because I'm a successful professional in Korea, the closest parallel would be sort of like Hong Kong, if you're all familiar with Hong Kong. In Korea, if I've got a successful practice, that means that I've got a nanny for the kids. That means I've got at least 1 or 2 housekeepers. I've got a cook. I probably got 6 to 10 servants in my house. So my wife, for example, would not even know how to wash clothes. She has a servant to do that. Her job is to manage the folks that run the house. She doesn't actually do anything. She has no job skills. She's socially, economically part of the same group that I am. So she got a college degree. She's well educated. She knows maybe some traditional Korean crafts or something like that. But her job is to look good, hang out with her friends, and go out for coffee or tea or something like that, and talk story about the latest soap opera. You know, she's part of the leisure elite because she's supposed to look good because she's a doctor's wife. And I've got my golf club membership, and I've got all the stuff that you would have, you know, if you're, say, a real successful surgeon here. That's my life in Korea, but even more so. Because I'm part of the top, you know, 1% of the system, and I think I'm like, you know, I can almost walk on water. So I suddenly come over here and I can't get a job. I can't get any job related to the only thing I know how to do. Now, think about it for a second. My wife's not going to be particularly successful in getting a job either. Neither of us know English because we never had any reason to learn English. And because we're part of the elite people, if we want a language, we hire someone to translate for us. So we don't know crap. We come over here with no idea. We've got a boatload of attitude. I know I'm a successful professional. I know I'm good at what I do. And I come over here and suddenly get told, nope, can't do it. Well, can I work in a dentist office? Nope, can't do that either. And I'm suddenly like, oh, well, now what do I do? So in many cases, what happens is if you walk through the area around Walmart, the Koreatown area there of just Malka Valawana Center, and you actually talk. Now, some of those folks have now retired, but it was real interesting to go down and talk to some of the folks you see in the smaller little Korean noodle shops and stuff. And even some of the folks who used to work at Sorbo, which you should go to if you've never been. The oxtail soup there is fantastic. Is that's what they ended up doing. They ended up taking some of the money they brought over with Korea and basically convert that to some sort of small, you know, restaurant or, you know, not even a restaurant, a noodle shop or something like that, just to have money coming in. And so suddenly you've got this guy who's actually a very skilled, high-end, technically proficient specialist who's literally doing noodles. And his wife, who her main problem before is, what do you do on Thursday to keep yourself occupied? Who are your friends you're going to go out to? What are you going to do today? Who suddenly finds herself wiping down tables, washing dishes, and mixing up soup base. And he ain't happy. And his wife's about 500 degrees south of unhappy. Because she's like, you know, what the F is going on? This isn't what I ever signed up for. This is not the life I expected. And this isn't what you told me we were going to be doing. This group has one of the highest rates of in-family violence of any group in Hawaii, which is totally not surprising when you think about it. Because unlike other groups where basically you're refugees and you had to leave, this group is leaving by conscious choice. Now, the really bizarre part of that is, we'll say, again, I come over in 1975. We'll say two of my friends who were also dentists in Seoul. It's now 4 or 5 years later. And they actually are contacting me and they're writing me letters or, you know, however they're contacting. They're basically saying, hey, you know, how's it like over there and how are things going? We're thinking of leaving too because it's still pretty sketchy over here in Korea and we're really nervous about it. And we'll say that I'm actually going to be pretty honest. I'm going to say, I mean, this totally sucks. This doesn't work. You know, they don't accept our degrees, da 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 da. And so I just completely just ran, you know, like for, you know, 5 pages or something like that about how totally effed up everything in here in Hawaii is and how it's a totally bogus, a bad idea. Don't even think about it. Now, the weird thing is you have to remember these guys are professionals. So whether they're lawyers or doctors or whatever, you know, their business is knowledge and data. They look at that letter of mine and almost to a person, what they think is like, oh man, I don't know what his problem is, but Borden's obviously bullshitting. It can't be that bad. He's making this up and it's obviously really good in Hawaii and he doesn't want us over there because we'll be competition. So we're going to totally ignore what he said. We're going to jump on a boat or we're going to jump on an airplane, fly over and bring the family over to Hawaii and set up shop because obviously it must be really good over there or else he wouldn't be giving us all this fake crap that he's making up about how bad it is there. And that's what happens. These guys just stack on top of each other. And I remember talking to one guy in a little noodle place actually right across from where Walmart is now. And the old Sung, I can't remember the name of that little shopping, you know, sketchy shopping mall is. There was a little noodle shop in there. And the guy was actually a second group. And, you know, I was talking story with him one afternoon when I was having dinner and he was like, you know, for some reason decided to vent. And he was like, yeah, you know, my friend said, you know, there was life in Honolulu was totally effed up and it was a totally bad idea. And I intentionally didn't listen because I thought he was bullshitting me. And I came over and guess what? He was right. So these guys kept on stacking despite people here telling them, don't do it. It's a bad idea. And these are all professionals. I'm not talking people with very limited education who have no idea what the hell's going on. you know, by the 1960s, 1970s, hell, they had TV and everything in Korea. You could easily see what life was like in the United States. They could have just written a letter to an American board agency, for example, and found out, can I be a dentist in Hawaii? And they would have told no. So it's really weird how their perception of what Hawaii was so strong that they totally ignored all the evidence to the contrary. And these are the folks that you see working in all the little shops and all the little stuff that you see, especially down there in the Koreatown area, including the folks working in the Korean supermarkets, not necessarily the folks that own them, but like the guy that's the butcher. In fact, the butcher at the one across from DQ's, or one of the butchers over there, actually used to be a surgeon in Korea. And now he's chopping up chunks of meat so someone can get a rib steak. You know, it's really, really, really unusual. And that's what's really striking about the Korean experience here in that second group, is almost to a person, they ignored the evidence that was actually very freely given. No one was trying to hide what was going on. It wasn't like the first one, everyone's playing games. The second one's totally straightforward, totally open. And of course, you literally could check, and the American government would tell you, and whoever licenses stuff here in Hawaii would be like, no, you know, a Korean dental degree doesn't mean anything here. You can't get a job in that area. These folks are looking at this stuff, and for some reason, either they don't. I suspect they don't ask. Even when people tell them this stuff, they're still like, nah, you guys are making this shit up. This isn't real. And boom. So next time you go down there, if you're going to Walmart or something, leave the Walmart, walk around that whole area and look at those little Korean places. And, you know, what you're going to find is people that were very, very much more successful in urban Korea, generally are part of the elites who are now working in little shops, not necessarily even owning them, just literally working in them for almost nothing. And what you find is one of the interesting side effects is because of the stereotype of gossip, as I think I mentioned originally with the Chinese, why can't these folks go back to Korea? If I'm this oral surgeon, I come over here and after 10 years, I say, F this, I've had it, let's go back home. What's the problem? I'll give you a hint, it has nothing to do with licensure. I can immediately get my job back as a surgeon. Why won't I go home? In fact, why won't my wife want to go home?
People will see you as a failure.
Mm-hmm. We're going to be the biggest source of talk for the next couple of months. And every time we go by anywhere in Seoul, everyone's going to get, yeah, boy, that guy's a total loser. Now, never mind if I start my practice up. In fact, it's very likely that if I start my practice up, no one will come into my place, because they'll figure that if I'm such a loser and I came back to Korea, I must really be a bad surgeon. So I probably won't be able to start up anyways. And I'm not dumb. I probably realize that. So once they've come over here, they basically burn their bridges behind them. Because of social pressure, they can't go home. It's not like the earlier groups, because political or other types of events, they couldn't go home because maybe home wasn't there anymore. This group still has home. They still have family back in Korea. I have no idea what happens when their family comes over here to visit them. It must be really interesting. You know, the family's wealthy. They come over here, you know, they come over here and they meet them at the airport. It's like, oh, you know, we decided to, you know, let you stay in the Trump Tower because we don't want you to stay with us because it's, you know, it's sort of messy and you guys like better stuff. I'm sure they go to great lengths to try to pretend that they're not what they are. Though I suspect the families must know. But boy, you could do some fantastic soap operas on that stuff, especially since Korean soap operas tend to be sort of depressing anyways. So it's an absolutely trippy group. I mean, the Koreans as a population in both these areas are totally different than any of the groups that come over. And if you understand that, it makes when you go shopping for Korean stuff, there's that really good little Korean store near the Foodland on Baratania, near the LDS church on Baratania. I don't know how to describe it before you get to Kamoku. By the way, very good stuff there, especially clothing, bedding stuff. I'm sure the ladies, I never had the courage to ask those ladies, I don't know them that well, but I'm pretty sure that they were significantly more successful in Korea than they are working in a retail outlet in Hawaii, in Honolulu. Though I suspect in many cases, I actually remember my wife asked someone at DFS, which is where the duty-free place where the tourists go, and they pointed out they actually had a hard time hiring Koreans here to work in shops in Waikiki. If you think about going to what someone just said, why would that actually make sense? Why, if I've got a duty-free shop, so I specialize in tourists, and there's a large number of Korean tourists coming over now. Well, there were till say 2019, and there's going to be a large number coming back in 2021, I'm sure. So in that situation, why is it going to be hard for me to find Koreans who are now moved here to work in that shop? Why won't those Koreans want that job? We'll say it's a perfume or jewelry counter, and I'm selling, and they sell Korean cosmetics. So they want to hire a woman here who's a Korean native speaker. So they're looking for someone who's a fairly recent immigrant. Why they find it almost impossible to find one of those ladies to work in that shop to cater to tourists, especially Korean tourists. It's another part of the same phenomenon about not moving back to Korea. What would maybe be even worse than moving back to Korea? If I'm a woman and my husband was successful, and then I moved to Hawaii and now he's not. Who's the last people I want to see in Hawaii?
All the other successful women back in Korea that are coming on vacation will see that, oh, you moved here, but now you have to get a job because your husband isn't supporting you anymore.
Yeah, and you're working as a retail clerk, which in Korea is a totally demeaning job. It's like one stage above being a maid. So, you know, there's no, I mean, hell could freeze over before those women would take that job. There's no way they would do it. Now, there's the thing, Chinese and Japanese, they got no problem with that. But then they're not moving over here for the same reasons, and they're not coming over here from the same socioeconomic group. Korean society, even in 2020, is stunningly rigid. I mean, you can never see if you look at like the boy-girl bands that you guys usually like to watch or used to when you were in high school. Those folks are on the outs. You could be in one of the most successful boy bands. This is why there's such a high suicide rate in those groups. Once you're not successful anymore, you're now considered trash. There's no idea of being successful socially, being successful publicly, and gaining status in Korean society. It's an incredibly rigid society. It's an incredibly closed society. And so, yeah, those women, there's no way in God's green earth, if they were down at a store like that, they'd have to pretend they were shopping there too. There's no way they could be caught actually working in that store, getting paid salary to be an employee. That'd be so demeaning. They would rather starve to death first. So, I mean, when you're looking at Koreans working here who are immigrants, and now in the last 4 or 5 years, it's changed a little. Now you see more middle-class Koreans come over, but still most of the Koreans coming over here are part of this, what was the social elite. And they're very careful where they work and who's going to bump into them because of their fears of this getting back to what they still see in many cases as home. Yeah, I don't know if they're unique in that regard. I think they are. Korean society, like I said, is a really fascinating case. I don't know enough. I've never spent that much time studying Korean society in detail. My specialty is China and Japan. And all I know is the more you understand about Koreans, the more you realize they got absolutely nothing in common with the Chinese and the Japanese. They happen to be physically next to each other, but they are not at all particularly closely related. And Korean society is pretty trippy. And South Korea right now is a very strange place. So, okay, with that, second set of our soap opera stories. I guess that sort of finishes the soap opera. Any questions or comments about that? So we're all good? Okay. Okay, on that note, I guess we'll call it a day.